Is the history of theatre in Wigan unique? We have an account from the Wigan Observer of November 1934 written by someone called R.J. Broadbent. And it's about a production of Romeo and Juliet at the theatre. Talk about where the theatre is in due course, in Wigan, which begs the question, is the history of theatre in Wigan unique? And this is how the story goes. In 1835, Henry Roxby Beverley, seen here, I actually found a picture of him, an English actor and low comedian, brought a company to Wigan to play some of Shakespeare's comedies and tragedies. One was Romeo and Juliet, but it became something of a comedy rather than a tragedy from a ludicrous incident which occurred during the progress of the performance. The juvenile leading lady, a good actress, and a very pretty woman, by the way, and a young mother, was cast to play the heroine. The baby had been placed in the dressing room for security and to be near the mother. But just before the balcony scene, the young tyrant became unruly and impossible to control. What was to be done? A mother's tact hit upon the true soothing syrup. She nestled the infant to her breast. I was going to make it a little bit more dramatic. She nestled the infant to her breast, and from that moment, the young villain became as silent as a mouse. Being called, she hastily mounted the rostrum that supported the supposed balcony, hastily throwing a lace scarf over her shoulders, which concealed the little suckling, and leaning over the balcony, with her other arm pensively placed upon her cheek, she looked the picture of innocence and beauty. The scene opened and went glowingly. But alas, Juliet has to appear and disappear 3 times, and in her effort to do so gracefully and yet conceal the child, she stumbled against the iron brace that held up the frail structure. Down fell the balcony, and lo, the lovelorn maiden was discovered with a baby at her breast, seated on a tub, which served for a stool, and at her foot, accidentally placed there by the thirsty carpenter, was a quart pot. The said carpenter was discovered on all fours, steadying with his back the rickety structure above. Shrieks of laughter from all parts of the house greeted this tableau, and the play no more was heard that night. Is this comic shambles an indication of an inadequate theatre culture in Wigan, separate and different to the great British theatre traditions and reputation epitomised by Shakespeare, Drury Lane and Covent Garden? The aim of this presentation is to look at a simple outline of Wigan's theatrical past and place it in the context of wider national development of theatre, and in doing so, to see what we can learn from the historical view. Establish, indeed, if Wigan's theatre culture was in some way inadequate or inferior. Now, I'm interested, as I'm sure you are, in the practical value of history for today. So what can it tell us about theatre for today in Wigan? The history, that is. What shall we consider and do to learn some lessons? Consider what is theatre, what is history and why bother? Do a whistle-stop tour of British history, theatre history. Tell Wigan's theatre story in the light of the whistle-stop tour. And then consider, finally, whether right now we are better off or worse off given the past. So, this presentation divides into 4 parts. This is why having a microphone and being on the stage is useful, because you can walk in front of the screen. Yeah, 4 parts. I'm going to briefly have a little bit of a chat about theatre and history. Okay? And then there's this whistle-stop tour, and I cannot emphasise how dangerous and risky this is to attempt that number of years in a short part of a presentation. I'm going to try a whistle-stop tour. That would get us to the first half. We're going to have a little break. And then in the second half, we zoom in on Wigan's particular story in the light of what we've heard in the first half and begin to work out whether it is unique or similar to what happened elsewhere. And finally, I've got a few slides on the right now, on what we might be able to learn about what we should be doing now, or evaluate what we're doing now, what we should do in the future by virtue of the history that we've considered. So briefly, but critically, what the hell is this thing theatre in any case? Often, the world of theatre is seen distant, separately, a place for eccentrics and show-offs. How do you drown an actor? Place a mirror at the bottom of a pool. How many actors does it take to change a light bulb? 100, of course. One to screw the bulb in, and 99 to stand around saying, "It should be me up there, and I could have done it better." To this day, the press, media can resort to notions of lovies and disposable, disregardable entertainment, fit for nothing but a bit of light relief from the serious business of living. In fact, theatre and performance are fundamental human strategies for understanding, invention, and insight. Shakespeare, in the person of Hamlet, says, "The purpose of playing, whose end both at first and now was and is to hold as 'twere the mirror up to nature, to show virtue her feature, scorn her own image, and the very age and body of the time was form and present." Augusto Boal, radical Brazilian theatre director, author of Theatre de Press, said, "Theatre is the first human invention. Theatre is born when the human being discovers that it can observe itself. When it discovers that in this act of seeing, it can see itself in situ, see itself seeing. And as social animals, we do this together. We share and bond. It's never just entertainment." Peter Guber, the film producer, says stories are tools to create social cohesion and to get humans to strategize together. And why bother with the past? Winston Churchill said, "The longer you can look back, the farther you can look forward." History helps us to understand change. We learn from past mistakes. We gain context for human experience. So let's look back. I'm going to attempt, ladies and gentlemen, a whistle-stop tour of British theatre history, how it changed and developed. It would be broad brushstroke with occasional detail, and its purpose is to provide a sense of how we have, over the years, come together to look at ourselves and propose ways to be. And then ultimately, how has theatre in Wigan provided the community with a sense of self? So first, early origins. Now, sort of origin theories of the theatre, you'll no doubt be aware from school, often begin with the Greeks. So over here we've got early Britain, our origin theories about where theatre comes from. But the truth is there is no singular origin. Our need to reflect on ourselves, our performative nature happens in many forms simultaneously, and the cross-fertilization of forms is complex. However, let's have a sort of starting point. So early Britain, seasonal rites, so-called folk traditions, players and gleemen. Then the role of Christianity, in this bit. The Christian church developed drama, but also it's a period in which there is a continuation of the professional performer. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. And then you've got the arrival of a more formal commercial theatre, epitomised by the national narrative of Shakespeare. Then the closure of the theatres during the Civil War and the restoration of the monarchy, but also the restoration of theatre influenced by French theatre, where the king had been in exile, and the long 18th century. And then the 19th century, of which we have most evidence relating to Wigan, how urbanisation and industrialisation transformed leisure and entertainment, giving us a diverse landscape of performance, but one which was class conscious and status conscious. And finally, down here, we can touch briefly on how cinema displaced key aspects of theatre traditions in the early part of the 20th century. Right. So here we go. The Whistle Top tour begins. Let me go back there. I mentioned at the outset that performance is a fundamental human activity. So there will always be those who represent, who mimic, who play back our lives to us. No doubt, at the dawn of Homo sapiens, around the fire, the story of the day's hunting was shared with the small community and was a way of passing on knowledge, the how-to, as well as conferring status. This is what I did. And it's a very small leap into stories of the imagination, which also make points and speculate about meaning in gods and monsters, things that we fear, and our vulnerabilities. A local in-house storyteller, unsurprisingly, became a way of life for some, offering their skill to others. Players are, so to speak, born of this. So, in early Britain, this tradition of the player is evidenced, however scarcely. Not surprisingly, the itinerants came and went and weren't likely to appear in the record, but some did. So, for example, an ordinance of 789 prescribed the beating or banishment of histriones, the actors, who donned clerical garb. In 969, King Edgar of Kent complained of a house of clergy known for a meeting place for actors, where mimes sing and dance. Gleemen, or scops, are specific storytellers of the period, but the mix would also include jugglers and other skill-based performances and musicians. And of course, the traditions and forms of the great civilizations are part of the landscape. Rome influenced by Greece, and Romans bringing their theatre to Britain. And of course, to reinforce the point about there being no singular cause and therefore effect, things exist alongside one another. This is true of how the traditions of the campfire, the Homo sapiens sitting around discussing the day's hunting, and its rituals persist in the forms of seasonal ceremonies and practices, rich in costume, music, dance, and symbolic characterization. The ways in which the agricultural economy, or life, was inextricably bound up with our celebration and reflection upon its meaning. So here you have some images of folk plays. You may have come across them. They only started to be recorded, folk plays, really, as scripts in the 19th century. They were an oral tradition. And so we can't really always understand where they came from, but they're certainly very ancient and would probably have been born out of the playing and the miming, the telling of stories that went on around the fireside. This little photograph here is, I believe, of Apollon, where I grew up. I'm on one of those Facebook groups about memories of Apollon. I happened to see this, and I just liked the fact that you could see the processional event taking place. So we've always had in this country, and true of other countries as well, folk traditions, performative folk traditions of one sort or another. And of course, then there are also gatherings of rural populations, which ultimately become fairs. And at key moments in the seasonal calendar, such as harvest. We'll talk a little bit more about fairgrounds later on in the presentation, but just for the minute, this is an illustration of Bartholomew Fair, and you can see in these etchings and drawings the theatre booths. We'll be talking about theatre booths in due course. Always part of the fairground scene. But before the more modern fairground, just those rural gatherings were inevitably going to include performance of some sort or another. Okay, so early Britain. What comes next? What should we talk about next? Well, we should have a look at the role of the Christian church. So where else did our use of representation, playing or dramatization occur? Well, the churches found a purpose. Of course, medieval churches were rich in visual communication because Latin was the language of the church service and the congregation was largely illiterate. Short dialogue and symbolic action was used as part of certain services. And in time, moderately elaborate stages of biblical events and stories took place in churches. However, ambitions and opportunities in time led to outdoor versions of this, at which point a new tradition of plays and playing emerged. So these short dialogues integrated into the church service ultimately became you'll have come across things like the Chester cycle plays and so on, the York mystery plays and so on, where the performances took place on wagons outside, but again telling biblical Christian stories, telling the story of the Christian faith. The professional players, they're always there, of course, continue to offer their services and entertain wherever they will be accepted. They have opportunity to put on shows, and communities often stage the cycle plays at significant dates in the Christian calendar. In addition to the telling of the Christian story, we have morality plays. You might be familiar with the play Everyman. It's often a school text, actually. It's often taught in school, Everyman. The Castle of Perseverance is a morality play. Here's a drawing which reconstructs what an original document tells us about the performances. So here's an example of where the staging is fixed. So you take an area, you have stages around an area, and the story is told around the area. Whereas in the cycle plays, and things like the York plays, the wagons moved and the audience stayed where they were. But in these kinds of performances, the audience move around and look at the staging in the different as the play progresses. And of course, don't forget, the Christian calendar was founded on the seasonal, if you like, pagan calendar, the one we would associate with the folk plays of the previous age. So all the performances and traditions of the period had an opportunity to be incorporated or reflected in the new forms and exist alongside them at the same time. So, I'm thinking of things as I'm going along here. So, for example, in some of the cycle plays, there are little short, quite a crude plays. The Second Shepherd's Play is a good example of this. Comedy, knockabout comedy, sheep get stolen, and all those kinds of things. They're very much more of the flavour of the folk play than the religious service dramatization. There's a kind of synthesis going on. So, in this period, churches, cycle plays, morality plays, local rural performances, players and entertainment are part of the scene. And then, if you want an origin story for Wigan's theatre, your best choice would be what happened next. So Henry VIII insists, through the agency of the Master of the Rebels, first established by Henry VII in 1494 and consolidated in 1543 by Henry VIII, that players and performances needed to be managed and therefore controlled through a patronage system. This occurred, interestingly, as part of an act designed to address vagrancy. Players could be regarded as an exception to vagrants. Please note that actors and players are vagrants in the eyes of society, always outsiders, always outsiders. However, Henry VIII has this idea that You can perform if you have, in essence, a sponsor of the right sort. That is to say, the right royal aristocratic sort. So players whose roots go back to the age of Gleeman need to organise in a certain way. The first such troupe or company is the Earl of Leicester's Men. And it was James Burbage, the leader of the Leicester's Men, who saw an opportunity to create a permanent home and, of course, a building in London. And as Simon Trussler, in his Cambridge History of British Theatre, puts it, instead of the theatre going to the people, now the people of London could go to the theatre, capital T, the name of the building. A controlled space with admission points and seats had arrived. I know you don't think of theatre as not having these things, but it did actually have to start somewhere. So you can see here, pre-Playhouse, the fit-up theatre. You put these up in inn-yards or wherever you could get an audience. But subsequently, the moment of inspiration was, how about having that, but containing it in a building, having admission points and charging people to come in? It was a way of kind of creating a real business of it. This drawing is the earliest drawing we have of this emergence of the outdoor theatre in London in the period, 1596 drawing of the Whips. So what you've got, admission, seating, staging, is the building of theatres, which is essentially Shakespeare's story. He was part, in effect, a new commercial theatre industry. His plays should be read as commercially conceived page-turners, just to confuse genres for a minute there. He needed to please a class-diverse audience and bring the punters in. Get them in through those admission points, fill your theatre, make lots of money. That was the whole purpose behind it. It's a bit like streaming services these days, really. You know, everybody competing to get subscriptions from people. You know, Netflix are out there, Prime are out there, and all that kind of thing. But essentially, Shakespeare's theatre was just the same thing. It's a new idea. People were putting these buildings up and putting on plays and competing with one another and trying to get the punters in. The genius of Shakespeare, of course, was that he was able to meet those aims, getting the punters in the commercial theatre, but also exploring at the same time with insight the political and human condition. After Shakespeare, we have what we term Jacobean theatre, but also Caroline theatre from 1625. Again, this is very broad brushstroke, bear in mind, because we're going to have to move at a great pace. You've got Ben Jonson, the playwright Ben Jonson, on the one hand, quite a literary figure. You've got Middleton and Webster, raw and bloody. It's not just about that. But if you do know Thomas Middleton's Revenge is Tragedy, I don't know whether you do or you don't, you'll understand why I say bloody and raw. I mean, these are kind of like slasher movies at the time, really, in a way. So the playhouses continued. There were private indoor theatres as well, with boy companies, and they kind of played to a more select and affluent audience. So that all went along very happily until 1642, when the theatres were closed because of the start of Civil War hostilities. It was perhaps at the time intended as a temporary thing, but it actually lasted for 18 years. When the performance places were closed, the closure of performance gave opportunities of a different sort. There was circulation of printed play texts. There were some rough and easily staged short plays, kind of performed against, in a sense, the edict of closing theatres. So then, after 18 years, at the interregnum, there was the Restoration. So in 1660, the unroofed playhouses, the things we just talked about in Shakespeare's experience, and the small number of private indoor theatres were abandoned. Charles II granted patent, that is to say permission to perform, to Drury Lane and Covent Garden, and minor allowances limited patents to places such as the Haymarket. We're talking about London, of course. So we should note a few things as we whistle through. The first is groove and shutter scenery. So just think about the difference between Shakespeare's theatres. In Shakespeare's theatre, it's daylight and the audience are here and they're in exactly the same light as the actors up here. It's quite noisy. People don't, they're not very respectful. They talk, they throw things around. And the scenic area is just kind of, you need to indicate a tree, just like up a branch. Or if you need to indicate a bear, you just put a bit of fur on, whatever it may be. Here, suddenly, you've got an area on the stage. It's really shut the staging arrangement, which means that you can do something more pictorial. And the changing nature of the stage is important to us. You'll see it's important when you come to talk about Wiggins Theatre. We can work out what went on by virtue of things like this. This is a printed libretto, and in it there are pictures of the staging. So it was able for theatre historians in the end to put this kind of thing together. Also, the arrival of women on the stage. Aphra Behn is the first female playwright in Britain. John Dryden is one example of the new generation of playwrights during the Restoration. Outside of London, some royal patents were granted. Have a look at that. Such as the Bristol Theatre Royal, you can see here. And local magistrates licensed unevenly local performances. And these powers were clarified in 1788 by a new act. But before that, and of most significance, is the 1737 Act. So please indulge me for a minute while I just talk about this. The 1737 Act came into being as a consequence of a developing theatre scene in London, where theatres proliferated, as did playwrights and plays. Plays inevitably became concerned with issues of the day and could be satirical about politicians. And the final straw was the threat of a play entitled The Golden Rump. Never performed, and no text has survived. However, the play was quoted in Parliament as justification for censorship, control of the theatre by Robert Walpole. Why was the threat of the Golden Rump so provocative? And here's the story. So it was written as a little sort of satirical, anonymous article, if you like. And this is the story of the Golden Rump. The visionary meets the noblesse of the kingdom on the way to celebrate the festival of the Golden Rump. The Golden Rump is easily identifiable as George II. The chief magician, whose belly is as prominent as the rump, is without doubt Robert Walpole, while the figure of Queen Caroline is presented as injecting a solution of aurum portabile from time to time from a contrivance that is a golden tube with a large bladder at the end, resembling a common clyster pipe. In other words, an enema. Into the Golden Rump to comfort the bowels and to appease the idle. You can imagine why Robert Walpole wasn't so keen on a play like this appearing on the London stage, can't you? When I was thinking about all of this, I just thought, if you want to kind of just switch and kind of understand the provocative nature of this, the Golden Trump. The Golden Trump is easily identifiable as the Trump. The chief magician is without doubt Keir Starmer. And the figure of Melania, maybe fake Melania. You can see why he didn't like the idea, and he used it as an opportunity to pass an act, which meant that all plays that were to be performed had to be checked by the Lord Chamberlain and allowed to go onto the stage. And do you know something? I don't know if you know this or not. That was the case for the next 231 years. We only actually abolished the Lord Chamberlain's office in 1968. It's a fascinating archive of plays and reports on plays, the Lord Chamberlain's archive. In fact, I'll indulge myself slightly. I had the good fortune when I was at university to have a meeting with Max Stafford Clark, who was the artistic director at the Royal Court Theatre in London, famous for putting on new dramas and new writing. And I was studying directing at the time. And yes, I went to talk to him about directing. And he had on his wall And he pointed it out because we talked about it. He had a Lord Chamberlain's office report on Edward Bond's play Saved. And he talked about it then, saying, look what they said. Look what they said about this play at that time. Yeah, that's the reason why I detour slightly. It was of great significance that censorship, essentially, of plays started then and continued right the way across the period that we're going to be talking about, certainly when we come to talk about the Wigan theme. Furthermore, legitimate drama, standard plot, spoken dialogue would only be allowed in patent theatres. This is what the Act said. So the consequence of that was that theatre entrepreneurs who operated fit-up companies, they were travelling theatre actor managers, taking stage effects with them. They needed to invent forms and circumnavigate the act. So what you get is non-verbal dramas, you get musical interludes, you get compilation programs that don't require the formal play. I can go back a bit now. I've also included, just as an opportunity just to point this out, a Hogarth etching here of a 18th century theatre audience. Worth bearing in mind the way in which theatre changes its nature over time. So in the 18th century, it was as important, well, certainly in the Restoration period, to be seen at the theatre as it was to see the theatre. So there was an awful lot of chatter, a lot of social interaction going on in the audience during this period. It's not the kind of theatre that we might expect to see today, where at the darkened auditorium we're all in reverence of what's happening on the stage. These are quite robust experiences of theatre. You get a little bit of that from this illustration as well. So circuit companies played in this period, in the latter part of the 18th century, start of the 19th century. The theatre entrepreneurs were these travelling theatre company managers, and they played in purpose-built theatres in town, moving from town to town on an established circuit. And then there were portable theatres, where wooden and canvas theatre booths, which also operated the circuit, but in this case, they took their premises with them. Now, bear in mind that Wigan's first hard evidence of theatre in the town comes from 1785, when these developments were occurring nationally. And of course, the most abundant evidence about Wigan's theatre life comes from the 19th century. So the national story is of particular significance to our story, which we'll follow. At the tail end of the 18th century, as urbanisation and industrialisation commences, the forces that shape theatre in the 19th century begin their influence. So London continues as London will in its own dominant way. It is the seat of political and economic power, so all its features and characteristics are particular and important. London had been the home to the leading patent companies, so writers and theatre professionals inevitably will want to secure their slice of the rich cake. So we'll always find a concentration of talent and innovation in a capital city. In London, theatre building and technological change and an increasing urban population and therefore customers or audience are trends to note. So, to give you some indication of the scene, and again, bear in mind, this is the scene that has an impact on what we're going to be talking about in terms of Wigan in due course. So we have the essential core patent houses in London, Drury Lane and Covent Garden, as established by Charles II. So still there, still important. And then the Olympic Theatre 1806, the Lyceum 1816, the Adelphi 1819, the Regency 1814, the Coburg, you see here, subsequently the Old Vic, originally the home of the National Theatre, don't forget. I could go on. I've counted 8 in the West End and 12 in the so-called suburbs during this period. And then there is the changing nature of the stage picture and the theatre-going experience. And what are we talking about in this regard? Well, one example is a glass proscenium curtain at the Coburg, which you can see here. So the audience sits in the auditorium with a curtain that comes down at the proscenium arch, and you can see yourself. Now, don't forget that in this period, entertainment, experiences. You can't put the telly on, you can't put the record player on, you can't put the radio on. So you want spectacular, you want visual things that happen to you. That's part of the attraction of it. So again, theatre entrepreneurs were looking for that and would provide these kinds of things. The introduction of gaslighting in 1817 was significant. I don't know whether you did know that the term being in the limelight refers to an actual technological innovation. So a little piece of lime was put in a gas jet, and that shone a bright green light at the stage. You used to follow the actor around. That's where the limelight comes from. Gas lighting meant that for the first time you could darken the auditorium and just light the stage. And suddenly the whole experience changes for an audience. It's a lot more immersive. It's a lot more pictorial. You can lose yourself in the dreams of the stage. It provides an opportunity for scenic designers. Cantilever balconies came in at this period in 1819 at the Adelphi, which meant that these areas of the theatre could get a little bit closer to the stage and make it a little bit more intimate. And in a sense, the fourth wall closed in at this point. Come across the term fourth wall, haven't you? The notion of the audience looking through, if effectively a transparent wall. It's as though the actors don't know you're there. You're kind of able to eavesdrop on events on the stage. But in a sense, it's the start of that process. So the new urban audience had a more immersive experience. That new urban audience, and it is important in Wigan as well. I've got figures for the increase in population in Wigan and how it might have impacted on theatre. But what we are looking at is, as you know, of course, a huge growth in urban population. And theatre entrepreneurs are always going to find an opportunity to work with that audience. So what you start to get in the cities are melodramas, penny booths, circus and spectacle of one sort or another. We'll be talking a little bit more about circus later on. In agrarian society, when we talk about early Britain and the rural society and so on, celebration and performance, music and drama, emerge out of and are integral to the seasonal calendar. In the industrial machine world, there is a separation of work and not work for the first time. So for the first time, leisure becomes a demand that needs satisfying. And bear in mind, for many, living conditions were not great, and therefore getting out to sweaty theatre spaces might be better than staying in cold, crowded accommodation. And that's why the entrepreneurs began to provide for that particular audience. From a social impact or social analysis point of view, we are witnessing the start of an expression of a different industrial psychology. I've always really liked this quotation because it captures something that I think we need to understand about 19th century theatre. John Hollingshead gives an account of the performance of Oliver Twist at the Victoria in 1861. Half the evil, low-browed, lowering faces in London are wedged in. I think the image captures it a little bit as well. 1,200 deep, perspiring, watchful, silent. Every man in his yellow shirt sleeves. Every woman has her battered bonnet in her lap. The yell when Bill Sikes murders Nancy is like the roar of 1,000 wild beasts, and they show their appropriation of the act and their approbation of the actor by cursing him in no measured terms. Again, it's not the reverence of the darkened auditorium particularly. There's this kind of football crowd kind of experience that would have happened in some of the 19th century theatres. And what I like, particularly draw your attention to, is the way in which the audience are, if you like, booing Sikes at the same time as cheering the actor. And we kind of have that experience to this day, really, when we watch soap opera. We all watch soap opera knowingly. We know we're watching a story that's been contrived and we're enjoying the story, but we're also able to sit at the same time and say, I don't think that was very well written and I don't really like that actor. You know, it's that self-conscious thing that you can get in performance. And Wigan was an archetypal new industrial town. So the kinds of experiences that we're talking about here um, do apply to what kinds of experiences people who lived in Wigan would have had. And we'll be looking at that when we look at the specifics of the theme. And down the pub, of course, there was always opportunity. Pubs were always social centres for games and sport and song. And in due course, the performative end of it, in particular music, got its own space, often a dedicated room. The landlord's incentive was clear to sell more beer. That's the wet link, so-called, and that was an essential part of the scene. And this separate space inevitably evolved. The first prominent innovations were quite grand and playing to a status-conscious audience, such as Charles Morton's The Canterbury, which is what this image is about here. This is pretty great. Charles Morton is talked about as being the father of the musical. We could argue about that. But nonetheless, it's this idea that food and drink and performance becomes a separate thing, a separate institution. It's not just the pub with something on it. It becomes a whole separate institution of its own. We can also, so you can see a little bit more here. This is Wilton's Music Hall. You may recall Wilton's Music Hall was part of the BBC restoration programme some years back. A project. It had remained untouched. It had managed to survive, Wilton's Music Hall in the East End of London. And it's now a professional venue. But again, the same model, which is a concert platform at one end of the stage, and then tables where people could eat and drink below. I mean, look at the Alhambra in the 1860s. That's a pretty grand place. And then you got here the City Varieties Theatre in Leeds, 1865. The reason why I've got this illustration here is to indicate the way things began to change. So the seating, the tables and the food and the drink eventually disappear and are replaced by stalls because the performance becomes more important. And that's kind of the start of the variety theatre. And when we come to consider the Alexandra in Wigan and the Hippodrome in Wigan, this is relevant background information. Got to make sure I get back. Oh, got it. And then, in our whistle-stop tour, we have cinema. So it's the evolution of performance, and it's a necessary switching terminology there. Theatre to performance is a broader sense of the thing. When we entered the 20th century, technology, and we had technology at the start of the 19th century with gas lighting and so on, we get new technology intervening now, the spectacle of the moving image. Imagine what that was like when, in the late 19th century, when you first were able to see movement like this recorded. And these contraptions, people were busy trying to create contraptions so that they could create movement and experience that kind of thing. Cinemas were now sprouting up in towns too small to have boasted their own theatre. Expectations of dress and behaviour were more relaxed, but the sheer physical luxuriance on offer was classless, and the dreams, a twice-weekly compensation for the drabness of impoverished lives. That's Simon Trussell in his Cambridge Illustrated History of British Theatre. So, hopefully that will open up. I need to click on that. So, what of Wigan? The way in which the national narrative, that quick whistle-stop tour that we've just done, plays out, no pun intended, in Wigan, I've divided up as follows. Before 1785, the theatre, the start of the evidence. Let's talk about what that evidence is in due course. The music halls, and we've just been discussing how music halls came about. The theatres. So often when we talk about theatre in Wigan, perhaps we're thinking about what happened on King Street and so on, but there's more to be said than that. And we've got circus to consider because Wigan had circuses as well. So we'll be looking at that in the second half. Can I just point out to you, before I do that, the Arthur Lloyd website is a very valuable resource as far as information about the Wigan Theatre is concerned. And most of that information comes from George Richmond. And I understand he did a talk for you a few years back, did he? Is that right? Maybe not. In the early days, yeah. So I contacted George. I'm trying to find out who he was, and I contacted him. I've been to see him. We've had lots of chats, and he's a really interesting book. So I just wanted to credit him with stuff. And his story actually is really very interesting because he actually did a lot of the research back in 1974. And he did it when he was an undergraduate and he was doing some stuff. And he got all this stuff together and then he found the Arthur Lloyd website and he posted it all on the Arthur Lloyd website. That's how it came about. In addition to that, Steve May, he would be amazed if he knew I was talking about them right now. So Steve May was a tutor at St. John Rigby, Sixthbourne College. He was one of my tutors when I was at St. John Rigby. And he wrote a draft MA thesis on the history of Wigan Theatre, and he never submitted it. But one day he gave it to me many years ago. He said, Phil, you might find this useful, because I think he knew I was looking into it at the time. And it's a really, he didn't complete it, I know, but it's pretty much complete. And he did a lot of very valuable work on theatre history. So I've been able to draw upon that along the way. So, timing. Oh, I got it about right. So what I'm going to suggest we do is we have a break now. So let that filter in a little bit, the background story. And in the second half, we will delve into this. And the intention is to look at this story, the Wigan story, in the light of the national story, and try and draw some conclusions from it. What can we learn about was Wigan different? Was it unique in some way? And also then to think about ultimately where we are today and what the future might hold. So, in a sense, I'm sorry to keep you waiting for the Wigan bit, but I hope you'll see it was useful to do the other stuff first of all. So the first evidence of theatre in Wigan relates to the theatre from 1785, and I'll come to that in a second. However, in the first half, I was kind of this broad sweep from early Britain right the way through to the 20th century. And there's this huge period in Wigan pre-1785. So what was going on? And is there something that we can work out from that period? So let's have a look at that. So as we looked at in the first half, we would expect rites and seasonal performances and fairs and fairgrounds and travelling pit-up theatres and all the rest of it. Just don't wander too much off script here. And we also know that the Romans were here at some point. Now we know little about that, but we might well assume that they brought their entertainment with them. So minstrels and gleemen. There's no evidence of a Roman theatre building in this area, such as the one we considered at St Albans that you saw in the slides in the first half. Wigan would have been too small a settlement, I think, for that. But certainly, we can assume, I think, stories, juggling, music would have been part of that period. What else might we say? Well, with confidence, we would expect seasonal rituals and performances. Evidence of the Lancashire Pace Egg play, for example, relating to Preston and Bury exists. So it isn't a great leap of the imagination to think along the way Wigan saw mummers and folk plays, and of course, processions and traditions. And perhaps more significantly, Wigan was granted a royal charter, as you know, in 1246, and what followed were 2 annual fairs. And the British Fairground was a rich and important environment for performance. So you can see here Wigan images. When we think of when we talk about Wigan Fair these days, I'd like to know more about this. I mean, having got started on all of this, I realised I'd bitten off more than I could chew, and there was also a lot more to find out. I think there's a lot more to understand about Wigan Fair, and our memory and the images that exist tend to be like this, the kind of standard, Silcox Fair, all of that kind of thing. But fairgrounds were more than that, as I indicated in the first half. So again, this is Bartholomew Fair with the theatre booth in it. And this one is an image of Nottingham Goose Fair from around about 1908. And down here in the corner, I noticed, is President Kemp's Theatre Unique. And I checked out President Kemp's Theatre Unique, and it turns out it was an early example of moving images. So it was a booth that took, at the end of the first half, we looked at the moving image and its appearance in performance traditions at that time. And they were going around the fairgrounds, and people could go and see early examples of cinema and the moving image. So fairgrounds are an important place for performance. Now, I don't have any evidence, as I'm saying, of performance at Wigan fairs, but a lack of record doesn't preclude its presence. And given that fairgrounds did have travelling theatre and musicians and skilled performers there, it's likely to be part of the scene. And then some circumstantial evidence might help. I came across an account of the history of the Theatre Royal in Tyldesley. It's in an edition of Past Forward, written by Brian Joyce. Brian Joyce wrote an article about the Theatre Royal. And what he says is this: in June 1890, such a wagon train disgorged its cargo at a vacant site in John Street, Tyldesley, and a 600-seat wooden theatre was swiftly built. The structure, 95 feet long by 32 feet wide, belonged to William Walter Brearley, who had entertained Horwich audiences in the building for the previous 2 years. So here, in the locality, we have an example of a portable theatre passing through. And then we have Josephine Harrop's seminal text on Victorian portable theatres. And what she was able to gained access to were records of Wilde's portable theatre in the 19th century. Very unusual for theatre records to survive like that. However, she managed to get hold of these and was able to piece together a history of Wilde's theatre. And in the case of Wilde's theatre, you can see places visited post-1850 includes Wigan and Leigh, and it's marked as theatre and circus, and Wigan had the privilege of seeing both the circus and the theatre. So we can see clearly that Wigan would have seen at points travelling theatre, and we had fairs. So I think it's not unreasonable to assume that it was part of the experience of the Wigan community to see that kind of thing. And then I happened upon a photograph in Wigan today. It's funny how you do these things. It's like when I was teaching, things like when I first started, things like Google and Wikipedia and all that kind of thing wasn't available. And these days, access to knowledge is so much better than it ever was. You have to be careful with it, but it's useful. People inevitably we all Google around a bit. And found this photograph, purportedly of possibly Millgate, they weren't certain, but from 1908. And what was of interest to me was this. There's a poster on the wall for the Wigan Annual Fair. And on it, it says, Wigan Annual Fair with Royal Motor Cars, Cinematograph, and Aunt Sally's Coconut Bowling. And it's the cinematograph that interested me because it reminds you of President Kemp's Theatre Unique. So it's circumstantial, but it just points to the fact that what was going on in Wigan probably was not that different to what was happening elsewhere. So the Wigan population, the community, probably did experience these kinds of things in that kind of environment. And what would determine the presence of these things at a fairground would be pure economics. A fair of significant standing, the number of visitors and traders, in other words, would attract professional entertainers trying to make a living, and Wigan fairs were indeed of sufficient prominence. Oh, just one other thing, just before I move on, just very, very briefly, thing to bear in mind about the fairground, you get this kind of very diverse nature thing, puppetry, curiosity shows, the bearded lady, that kind of thing, skill and spectacle jugglers and all that kind of thing, and plays of the day. The important thing about the fairground is it's what I would refer to as a universal audience. Everybody and anybody can go to the fairground, and all of the usual strictures of society evaporate on the fairground. Class, it's not class conscious in quite the same way. It's liminal. It's outside of societal fairground. And I think it's important to bear that in mind because when we come to talk about other theatre games in terms of Wigan, that relationship with an audience is important to consider. Okay. So, to the first available real evidence. The first evidence of Wigan's theatre story appears to be a playbill of 1785 for the new theatre at the Eagle and Child. So, the Eagle and Child stood at the top of Standish Gate, which became Woolworths, then W.H. Smith's, and is now, if you may have noticed, the Coffee House. And the Eagle and Child subsequently became the Royal Hotel. You can see here a drawing from the Illustrated London News in 1853. That's this drawing of the Royal Hotel. Interestingly enough, the sign has an eagle, I think indicating its previous identity as the Eagle and Child. And then we have a photograph of the same site with the Royal Hotel. You can see the Royal Hotel name here at the top of Standish Gate, and it's behind this building that the theatre existed. Now, you'll recall from the first half how circuit companies and the establishment of single theatre venues in towns grew in the latter part of the 18th century and into the first part of the 19th century. And this is, in fact, our own example. So how did it work? Well, companies would come in and perform at only certain times of the year. There wasn't a permanent company then. And because of that, sometimes theatre companies would appear in these venues at times like at horse racing times or at times of fairs and so on. I can't see any evidence of that for Wigan, if I'm honest, but it may well have been the case that took place. The practicality of the single venues in the provincial towns was simple. If every theatre venue in all of the towns was pretty much identical or very similar, it meant that companies could bring stock scenery and set it up and create theatre performances very easily. So they were kind of empty spaces which could be utilised for creating performance. The significance of this occasional use of a space is that it was like a special performance. It would attract Wigan society, given the available entertainment of the day. People had a chance to experience live theatre, which for the most part they couldn't. And it's worth noting that the theatre was also used for, according to an account in that Wigan Observer account in 1934, Paul Doherty, Irish music master, and a diorama depicting the Battle of the Tuileries and the attack on the Palace of the Louvre. Have you come across dioramas before? The dioramas were kind of theatrical, not optical, illusion. A dictionary entry of 1848 says this about them: a contrivance for giving a high degree of optical illusion to painting, exhibited in a building prepared for the purpose. This is done chiefly by peculiar distribution of light by means of folds and shutters concealed in the roof. The intensity of illumination may be increased or diminished at pleasure. In some cases, they also had kind of big canvas rolls, and they would make the scene, the picture move. But the whole point was, again, a visual effect. So we've seen a diorama at the theatre in Wigan. What else have we got? It was also used as a ballroom, and the newspaper report of 1836 tells us that there were astronomical lectures held there. So we can see it's intermittent in terms of its nature for theatre, in terms of its use for theatre, and a multi-purpose venue. And don't forget the alehouse, because all of these events bring in the punters. So these occasional plays, therefore, need to appeal in a certain way, and there is an element of something for everyone. And you can see this from the playbills that we have. And here are some of the surviving playbills from the theatre at the top of Standish Gate there. So what we have here are provincial versions of London's successes. These will, of course, be effective dramas, so guaranteed to work on an audience, but they also have the allure of having been London Fair. I suppose it's a bit like kind of now 1803 for the theatre. This is what's going on right now. So if we look at a bill, the bill of 1803, you can see a compilation or variety program with different levels of theatrical appeal and impact. Drama, music, theatrical spectacle, and visuals and sketches. A full evening out with something for everyone. The Poor Gentleman, which I'll talk about in a second, is a successful London play being performed in the provinces. The 1824 bill provides us with a little bit more information. We can see at the bottom a pricing structure with boxes at 3 shillings for the well-off, with a kind of class structure, but a class structure also indicates that kind of diverse audience, lots of people there and so on. But also half-price admission at 9 p.m. And this was a thing that came to be in the early part of the 19th century because industrial workers worked late, and when they came out of work, they might have wanted some leisure, so they had an opportunity to access the theatre programme, but late on and at half the price. So again, what you can see here is an attempt by the theatre, and the theatre management and so on, to make sure that something reached out to everybody in the community. So plays like The Poor Gentleman and The West Indian, let's just take a look at that. These are successes from elsewhere. It's a comic opera. It's printed and out. It's got a London showing of it. But here, appearing in Wigan, The Poor Gentleman, George Colman the Younger. He also wrote John Bull, which is a play that was also on at the theatre. He's a successful playwright at the time. Just to give you a little bit of a flavour of this, the story centres on Sir Robert Bramble, a wealthy but eccentric man who enjoys playing pranks and observing the reactions of others. He pretends to be poor and disguising himself to interact with various characters, including his nephew Frederick, who is in love with the daughter of a wealthy merchant, but also the merchant himself, that is to say, interacts with him, who is easily swayed by appearances. Through a series of comical events, Colman satirises social pretensions, highlighting the absurdity of judging individuals based on wealth and status. Ultimately, the play reveals the importance of genuine character and integrity over superficial appearances. Actually reminds me of the government inspector, that description. So it's a kind of nice mixture of comedy, intrigue, and serious point, and it captures that broad audience sweep, as we are talking about respectable but grounded dramatic entertainment. And of course, the theatre is Wigan's circuit theatre space venue, as discussed earlier, and the development of companies and circuits outside of London, alongside the widening of the Theatre Royal. We talked about that before. So, what do we have? Go back. R.J. Broadbent, the Wigan Observer, tells us that John Welch's company, this is just an indication of how it fits in with what's going on elsewhere. John Welch's company visited, this is Welsh here, visited Wigan. His circuit included Blackburn, Chorley, Ormskirk, Prescott, Stockport, and Buxton. And Broadbent in the Wigan Observer appears to have got this information from a contemporaneous newspaper, the original Theatrical Observer of 1821. Then we've got John Howard's company, said to have operated theatres in Lancaster, Preston and Blackburn, Rochdale and Stockport. And he took charge of the Wigan Theatre in 1822. In Broadbent's account, he provides the story of Howard bringing Clara Fisher to Wigan. Let's have a look at Clara Fisher. So Clara Fisher was a famous child star. She actually appeared at Drury Lane in Garrick's Lilliput when she was 6. I suppose it's a bit like Home Alone was for Macaulay Culkin. You know, you kind of appear in the right drama at the right time as a child, and you're made for the rest of your life, really. And so it was true for Clara Fisher. She went on to became very well known in America, and worked with some of the greats of the period, including William Macready and Edmund Kean. Now, it's difficult to verify Clara Fisher being at the theatre in Wigan, and it comes through the Wigan Observer account, and I can't work out where Broadbent's got a lot of his information from, or she got her information from. However, we do know that Clara Fisher, having been successful in London, did move up and down the country and appear in various places before she emigrated with her family to America in 1827. So the dates certainly do make sense. And she died in New Jersey in 1898. And then we've got John Stanton's company, subtitled Their Majesty's Servants, who presented The Honeymoon in 1808, and they operated across Wigan, Blackburn, Bury, Lancaster, Preston, and Rochdale. These playbills kind of tell us about the ecosystem of performers, and it would tolerate a sort of footballing analogy, really. You've got star players used to attract audiences, such as Clara Fisher, and then you have also solid, stalwart players like Mr. and Mrs. Thornhill. Can't work out who Mr. and Mrs. Thornhill are. Can you see them here? They appear on a few of the bills, including sort of benefit nights and so on. So they must have been familiar to the London audiences at that time. Now then. So, the theatre. Wigan had its theatre. But let's place that first theatre in a wider context. On the Arthur Lloyd website, George Richmond, who I was telling you about earlier on, tells us this. From 1841 onwards, the Wigan Theatre had experienced a mild form of competition from another hotel only a couple of 100 yards away, when occasional circus and dramatic entertainments were given in a room behind the Ship Hotel in Millgate. In 1849, this accommodation underwent much improvement and was opened as the Royal Adelphi Theatre. So I'm using the Adelphi Theatre as a sort of bridging example. A pub with entertainments, it starts out as. Exactly the arrangement that we saw earlier, which gave rise to music halls, but at first with pretensions to be a theatre like the theatre. Interestingly, it didn't last long. George Richmond provides an account from the Wigan Times of 1850. The other night I strolled into the comfortless, mistermed theatre, this is the Adelphi Theatre, to witness the performance of The Lady of Lyons, one of Bulwer Lytton's best plays, a play that cannot fail to please no matter how poorly it may be enacted. The performance was stated to be under the patronage of the mayor, but he was not present, and I must say he did well to keep away from a place so unsuited to his position and comfort, for it was the most desolate appropriation of the performance of the legitimate drama, note the term legitimate, I have ever witnessed, and certainly a disgrace to the town of such respectability as Wigan. I think what it reveals is the entrepreneurial character of most landlords. I suppose it was worth a go, wasn't it? Trying to set up a theatre at your pub too. They might have been better. The theatre manager was Anna Newby, who had experience of managing theatres in the Northwest. They might have been better just sticking to the pub entertainment, because the success of that model is seen elsewhere at the Old Dog and the Alexandra. But in addition, and this is information that doesn't appear on the Arthur Lloyd website, but actually appears in Steve May's thesis, actually, the Bricklayers Arms Music Hall and what was the music hall Critchley's, which was at the Royal Oak Hotel. The Old Dog people do tend to know about a little bit, and the Alexandra. Just jump to another slide for a second. A couple more illustrations of what we're talking about here. Another illustration of the Adelphi Ship Hotel, behind which was the Adelphi. And this is the Old Dog, survived quite a long time. before it was eventually demolished. You can see here the empire, assigned for the empire, because up there is the Alexandra, which was for a period known as the Empire and the Palace of Varieties. And here's a playbill from the Alexandra of the Empire with George Formby Sr. On the bill. So, just go back. So, what are these musicals? George Richmond was telling me a story actually about George Formby Sr. He says, I don't know where he's got the story from, that Charlie Chaplin, who we will mention again shortly, Charlie Chaplin is known to have performed at both the Royal Court Theatre in Wigan and the Hippodrome. George says that Charlie Chaplin saw George Formby Sr. whilst performing, I think, at the Hippodrome. And he was there, it was from that performance, he got the idea of the little tramp, the bowler hat and the clothes and the outfits. I can't verify that, but it's a nice story. So it could be that Wigan perhaps might have been the place of the creation of that most famous of cinematic icons, Charlie Chaplin, Little Tramp. What have we got here? Comic newspaper. Our examples are mainly late 19th century for what was going on in these places. The Alexandra, of course, let's just talk about that for a second, is a purpose-built musical. So the Old Dog is like that model of the pub with a room and some entertainments going on. And we talked about how that kind of, the room got moved up and became a separate institution. Of course, that's what the Alexandra was. It was a purpose-built hall. And you can see here the kind of bill of fare that you would have got. Carl Moretti, Dutch and Tyrolean vocalists, Corporal Higgins, Ching Nook and Alice Doughty, exhibition of foils, single sticks and boxing. I tell you what, it must have been a great night. Miss Dolce, boxing admirably for a woman. Miami, champion lady rifle shot. Madame Millie Zaza, double voice Creole vocalist. The Sisters of La Blonde, stars of the air. And Yasso, the Japanese juggler. The difference with a variety program like this, an all-embracing program like this, from the theatre, in the theatre, those playbills with poor gentlemen on it and all that kind of thing, you've got kind of the respectable formal play plus other things. Here it's gap. It's popular entertainment. And just that. All-embracing, high quality, all that kind of thing. And we've got a little bit of information about what it was. I'm trying to evoke a little bit about what it was like in these cases. The Old Dog, we've got newspaper reports talking a little bit about that. Steve Constable reported in the Comet newspaper in 1887 saying, "I believe very few females attend this house, and that tends to lessen the chances of disaster. A jolly lot of boys watching an often all-female company. And down at the Bricklayers, a company of artists to suit the most cross-tempered individual." The thing about popular entertainment, separate to other kinds of entertainment, when you are a popular performer, you have to look your audience in the eye and connect. You always have to be aware of what's going on. Comedians always have to do that. They have to work out who's in the room. That's why comedians often say, "Oh, I came to Wigan the other week and I went down the old whatever it was," and everyone goes, "Oh yeah, I know that place." It's connection. It's all about. So being able to reach out and deal with people is always important. The attention received, the genial courtesy of the young ladies who so ably dispensed the cup of cheers contributes to general enjoyment. So these are kind of bonhomey, smoky, drinky, good fun places to be, often with an MC looking after it. Now, why might something like the Alexandra be possible and likely in the circumstances in that separate musical place? Well, this is the period in which social order is shifting. Workers and their tastes have influence because in wider society, by this period, we have unionization and rising wages. The industrial class have more clout. Miners' wages, for example, rose by 40% in the period 1887 to 93. And so entertainment entrepreneurs would look to please. That might mean attracting so-called respectable audiences and offering high quality, popular acts. That kind of explains part of the reason why the music halls existed in the way that they did in the Wigan scene. So the arrival of the Alexandra in 1874 with the bill that we've just looked at needs to be seen in the context of Wigan's other developments of the period. So first, the Theatre Royal in 1851, the Queen's Theatre in 1876. Let's get these up on the screen. The Queen's Theatre in 1876, and most significantly, the Royal Court in 1886. Significant because of the scale of investment. The Hippodrome belongs to a slightly different evolution of circumstances, but we'll talk about that in a second. But first, what is the significance of these developments? The two things, economic development and affluence, and the 1843 Act. We already talked about one Theatre Act, and there's another one to talk about. The early part of the century saw economic challenges. Theatre declined in the 1820s and 30s because of economic downturns. However, Britain saw something of an economic boom 1850 to 1873, and Wigan, as a key player in the technological and industrial revolution, would have benefited business. So economic winds were blowing in the right direction. In the 1843 Act did away with the patent system for the first time. That was still in operation at that time. And it created a divide in types of theatre, and therefore created a distinct choice for theatre or venue managers. That is to say, drinking and smoking were not allowed in legitimate theatres. So if you wanted social standing and respectability, you would choose to become, if you like, a proper theatre. But choosing music hall with smoking and drink, you had the option to supply the new industrial class with popular entertainment. So the type of venue that the Alexandra was belonged to the latter category, whereas the Royal Court went very clearly for respectable status, including royal endorsement. A letter from the palace was read out on the opening night. However, we should look first at the Theatre Royal. A theatre perhaps with something of a split personality. We have it as something of a competitor to the Alexandra in the guise of the Theatre Royal of Varieties, and then a refurbishment in 1890 sees a respectable play approach, something akin to the Royal Court. To note here, the Theatre Royal was built to the rear of a private house in 1851, and the house was subsequently granted a license to sell alcohol. So once again, like the Adelphi, we have a pub theatre synthesis. Of particular interest is ownership and investment in entertainment in Wigan. And this really has kind of caught my attention, and there's work to be done here, I think. So in 1890, at the time of refurbishment, which is mentioned on the right-hand side of the screen here, the Royal Theatre Royal was under the control of H.J. Wersick. H.J. Wersick. You may well have come across him, I don't know. He subsequently built the Royal Court and the Hippodrome. He closed the Theatre Royal when he opened the Hippodrome. And he created Wigan Entertainments Company Limited, who went on to operate the Pavilion Cinema at the bottom of Library Street. And I think the Wersick story is possibly a future presentation, really, because it appears, from what we've dug out so far, that he was the son of a pub landlord who was at first a sign writer and then became a business representative for Wilson Barrett's company and Hamilton's Diorama, amongst other things. And we can see from his obituary here, which appeared in the Liverpool Daily Post, where this information has come from. And we can also see from the record that he was worth, in today's money, something in the order of about £2.5 million at the point at which he died. The Royal Court, he spent £18,000 on building it. And again, in today's money, that is roughly £2.5 million. That's a huge investment. So the Wigan Entertainment Fund Limited fascinates me, and actually the role of that family, because they were all involved in the theatre industry ultimately. I think I would like to dig out a little bit more. I don't know if anybody knows any descendants of the Wilsons because they're I think a well-known Wigan family. They came from Wigan. They kind of built this thing up. So the Royal Court in particular was a kind of uh, of significance, I think, given this particular family. Um, so yeah, we've got the theatre. Go back to the Theatre Royal, which he owned. So he closed the Theatre Royal when he opened the Hippodrome. It had a period of being a variety style theatre, and then over here we have the play approach, the spectacle play approach. So before we do look at the Royal Court, Wessex Royal Court, we should just briefly consider the Queen's Theatre. So the Queen's Theatre was built in 1876. It was a wooden and iron structure on the site of the ultimately the Queen's Concert Hall, so opposite the Market Hall. So the Market Hall opened the old Market Hall opened in 1877. Queen's Theatre opened in 1876. And its main claim to fame is that it burnt down. So it was only open for a couple of years. But what's of interest, and there's a story here about how it burns down. What's of interest to me is the fact that in the newspaper report about the fire, we learn that who the proprietor is, Robert Foster, and the cost of the building, they say, was £2,000. 10 years later, Wessex spends £18,000 on the Royal Court Theatre. So what then of the Royal Court? Wessex great investment. Let's have a look at that. George Richmond on the Arthur Lloyd website tells us this about the programme at the Royal Court. The D'Oyly Carte Opera Company paid a number of visits to perform the works of Gilbert and Sullivan. Other operatic entertainments were provided by the Carl Rosa Opera Company and the Moody Manners Opera Company. Forbes Robinson brought his company to present dramas. Lighter entertainment was provided by such people as Fred Karno's celebrated company. And here's Fred Karno's, and this is Charlie Chaplin was in Fred Karno's for a little bit. I'm always interested that Fred Karno entered the general vocabulary of the country, did it not? Just like Fred Karno's, people used to say. Chaos, like Fred Karno's. He specialised in these chaotic, comic, knockabout comedies. Other dramatic entertainments were performed by less well-known companies. So we've got playbills for plays, The Price of Sin, The Girl Who Lost Her Character, Maria Martin, great favourite, to judge by repeated advertisements in the local press, Humanity. And another advertisement, and this is interesting, I think, 15th of November 1891, said, the eminent tragedian Mr. Osmond Turle would shortly appear at the Royal Court playing Hamlet on Monday, Macbeth on Tuesday, Othello on Thursday, Shylock, Merchant of Venice Friday, and Richard III on Saturday. Not bad, that, is it? Sounds a bit like a Cure song. Yeah, and the point about that is that, again, it's this broad appeal, isn't it? You've got the plays of the day, you've got the light entertainment, you've got the seriousness of Shakespeare, you've got opera companies. It's that, and it was very, very luxuriant and very well furnished. George Richmond, who we've been talking about, does a lot of drawings of theatres. He imagines them for us, and he's got a drawing of the inside of the Royal Court Theatre with its plush velvet and its nice interior. And then we've got, I'll just get my control right here. We've got the Hippodrome. So the Hippodrome falls into the same category as the Alexandra, but represents a further evolution. Do you know something? I'm assuming you know where all these places were. So, no? So the Royal Concourse is still there. And we'll talk about that in a second, on King Street. And the Hippodrome was at the bottom of King Street. And next door was the Theatre Royal, which became subsequently the Shakespeare Hotel when the Theatre Royal shut behind it. And its job would be like taken over by the Hippodrome. So the the Hippodrome represents a further evolution. Music hall, in essence, transitions into variety theatre. Music hall was a kind of cruder performance form, perhaps epitomised by the double entendres of Mary Lloyd. But as the century ended, venues sought respectability. And in 1912, dramatic sketches of up to 30 minutes were legalised. And in the same year, the first Royal Variety performance was held. And if you ever want a mark or a badge of respectability, is when the royal family start coming to your theatre. So yeah, variety. The musical was a bit risque, really, but the variety theatre became respectable. So the Royal Variety performance came into play at that stage. So the Hippodrome was our version of that trend taking place elsewhere, and it saw people like Charlie Chaplin, Gracie Fields, George Formby Sr., and of course all of these people, including Laurel and Hardy, who kind of started out in the musical variety tradition, ended up in the cinema, and the cinema is the next port of call, if you like, for things. It ended tragically, really. Frank Fortescue, remember him? He was with Ronnie Barker in Heaven earlier. He did a weekly rep during the summer at the Hippodrome. They had variety theatre in the winter, apparently. Again, George Richmond was telling me that by the time we get to the fire 1956, this was the last thing that was staged at the Hippodrome. Things had got a bit seedy. He did actually say "dirty man." But it was a fire. And he tells the story. He knew a woman who worked there at the Hippodrome at this time. And he tells the story of how the morning after the fire, she walked onto the stage at the Hippodrome and it was still set, untouched and perfect. But as the view, who were never told, they lifted up the fire curtain at the Passini March and there was the devastated auditorium. And the theatre, that was the end of it. It never happened again. It was demolished subsequently in 1960. Was it an insurance job, I wonder? You never know. Things were not going well for it. This is an interesting little aside. James Brennan became part, or took over. I'm not quite certain about this. I need to look into this about the Wigan Entertainment thing. But James Brennan was part of a Mancunian Films, who were based in Rusholme, who were involved in the distribution or the making of Frank Randall film. So really what was going on in Wigan in so many ways was, there's a lot of quite important entertainment figures passing through and having an influence on what went on here. Okay. And the not quite final part of the story is circus. Yes, Wigan had its circuses. Well, more than one. When we talk about circus, we kind of immediately conjure up images of striped big tops and lion tamers and clowns, of course. But actually, the evolution of circus is quite different to that. The origins of circus lie in equestrianism and riding displays. So conventional histories of circus identify Philip Astley as the so-called father of circus. And what he did was he established a riding school on the south bank of the Thames in 1768 and presented riding displays there. But over time, he added other entertainment to the program, such as rope acts, rope vaulting, artificial fireworks, waterworks, that kind of thing, including, I know from the information I've got available, a zebra walking and a learned pig. So he kind of had an eye to, again, entertaining in a certain kind of way. And what he did was he took these activities and he moved them indoors and into the evening. So he created a covered arena for people to experience these things, and you could operate in the evening. And it was Astley's invention, if you like, this amphitheatre in London, which allowed these kind of things to happen. It was seen by a character called Charles Dibdin, and he opened the Royal Circus in 1782, having seen Astley's success. And that's how the word circus gets into the lexicon. So, in essence, these places were circular riding areas, as one would expect in a riding school, covered, incorporating audience seating, programs of performance including, of course, riding displays, often involving narratives, and all the other acts that Astley introduced. So the circus format evolved out of riding schools. Just to illustrate this point, this is from George Speight's A History of Circus. Here's some examples of exactly that. Round covered building. This is Hengler's Circus in Dale Street in Liverpool, and the Rotunda in Vauxhall Gardens in London. You can see the area, but you can also kind of see seating areas at the stage as well, and the covered area. So in Wigan, what happened? Well, the first circus was on Walgate, opposite the Northwestern Station. You'll notice here an interesting connection with Hay Hall. In the Recollections of Wigan by an equestrian manager, C.W. Montague, he talked of negotiating an equestrian fate for Lord Lindsay's eldest son's coming of age. The site was subsequently became Adams Royal Circus in 1871. It had a period of time as the Star Theatre of Varieties and Weston's Royal Amphitheatre. Here we have a description of what it's like inside. The building has been fitted up and decorated very tastefully and is undoubtedly the best of its kind ever constructed in Wigan. The patrons of the reserved places are accommodated with lounges in crimson velvet. The boxes are furnished with chairs. The structure also includes a commodious pit, promenade and gallery. It's brilliantly lighted by means of large coronas in the centre and a multitude of jets on either side. This program is Newsome Circus, but it happens to be a travelling version of it because it's located in the marketplace temporarily. And it is, to continue with the Hay connection, it is has the patronage of the Earl and Countess of Crawford of Balcarres. There's a reason for that we'll look at in a second. And then we have Transfield's Royal Circus. This was on Downing Street. Transfield's clearly some national chain, if you like. So you've got them here in Wigan, 1891. You've got them in Coventry between 1884 and 1905. You've got them in Limerick in Ireland, 1894. I might have found this by chance. That's for sale, is a historical document for sale, which is Transfield's Hippodrome, an agreement to occupy and provide a circus. Now, it's got a date, which is 1904, not certain where. The document is listed as being Gillingham, but certainly what we do have is Transfield's being some kind of national company operating in lots of different places. And the reason why I mention the patronage of the Earl of Crawford is this. The Comet 1789 says, many who object to theatres and music halls visit circuses with their wives and families, and they may do so in the case of the Grand Circus without fear of hearing word or phrase that could call the indignant blush to the cheek of the purest maiden. So circuses were kind of offering a discount fare. So we talked a little bit about the spectacle plays and mixed entertainment at the Royal Court, the Royal Hotel, Theatre Royal, and so on. Circuses were offering something else, something lighter, perhaps, and more respectable. And here you can see a bill for Transfield Circus. It doesn't feel challenging. no Mary Lloyd here. Always horses and ponies. There's always riding in those circuses because that's kind of where the origins are. And of course, Newsom appearing in the marketplace is interesting, I think, because it's a further indication that we were used to the marketplace and the fairground being places where travelling theatres and travelling circuses and so on pass. So, the final phase of development, if I can get back to my original slide, will I do that? I did. Is cinema. The next phase of entertainment was centrally about the arrival of film. And we can see here the Ritz, a pretty grand thing in the Ritz. The palace and the pavilion. The Royal Court was to become, of course, the court cinema in due course. We will talk about that early on. And it tells that story of moving from theatre to cinema in so many ways. The palace and the pavilion started out as roller skating rinks. That was interesting to discover. Another way, another view along the way of that kind of wider cultural scene. You know, the fairgrounds had lots of different things in them. And in the end, the streets had lots of different things. You go skating, you go to the cinema, you go to the theatre, and all that kind of thing. The Ritz was a fairly grand thing, and it also had a fly tower and dressing rooms because it was intended to be like a hybrid venue. It could also be about the theatre as well as about cinema. And George Richmond again was telling me that Wigan Amateur Operatics, I think that's what he said, at Wigan Amateur Operatics, were one of the first people to actually make use of the theatre facilities. And they went in and they roped up the fly tower and all the rest of it. And as a consequence, they were called back to facilitate a performance by the Beatles in 1964. So it did get used as a theatre, the Ritz, but not in a professional sense. You may have come across this, Brian Murphy's book, The Pleasure Palace, and he charts the history of cinema with it. That's another presentation altogether, I think. So, have we arrived somewhere? From beginnings to the start of the 20th century, was Wigan's theatre history unique? Well, no, it wasn't really. It's consistent with developments elsewhere. However, I think the Royal Court Theatre does represent a confident and aspiring town. And subsequently, the Hippodrome also indicates affluence and the engagement of the town's community with one another and the themes of the day, which are present in the plays and the popular acts of the day. Popular entertainment speaks volumes about cultural perspectives. Northern comics such as George Formby and Frank Randall, for example, tell us about a confidence in being northern and working class. It isn't, in the end, all about the latest London and often middle-class play. But as we've said at the outset, history is only valuable if it facilitates looking forwards. Oops. I don't remember how to get back. There we go. What about live theatre for Wigan today? But if you bear with me and indulge me for a second, I'm just going to talk very briefly about where it leaves us or what kind of lessons we might take from it. What about live theatre for Wigan today? Do we have it? Do we need it? Do we want it? I just wanted to reflect on that briefly before I conclude. What can we see from our narrative of history? Well, whether it's a capital city or a prosperous market towns or affluent new industrial towns and cities where there is disposable income and an inclination, people will look for the value added, the higher, the reflective. Theatre, as we established at the start, is the ultimate communal tool for looking at ourselves and understanding our experiences. A town without art and theatre is a symptom of ill health and malaise. Moreover, maintaining art and theatre and performance over time, continuity, is how we maintain identity. Annual fairs, regular theatre, and creativity are signs of well-being. So a quick health check. What have we got and what did we have? Amateur activity does persist. Wing Little Theatre is perhaps the strongest example. And we have, though, venues not being used and professional companies that came and went. And what should we expect? The cultural strategy for Wigan, just out, 2025 to 30, is sparse when it comes to live theatre. We can, of course, invest. There is much talk these days of the economic impact of the creative industries, and the council prides itself on claiming inward investment. However, are the money headlines all they seem? For all the heralded news of successful funding, is it translating into the kind of well-being our history of theatre suggests can be the case? Looking at the immediate future and recent investment, I have concerns that the talk of money and actual impact from money are different things. I feel concerned. As a town, we haven't got our eye on the ball. That one's still working. We're all right. Yes, two significant case studies here. The Old Courts. I don't know whether you're aware of this, but I worked out that the Old Courts has something in the order of about £4.25 million in recent years. And currently there's no theatre, no Royal Court Theatre, some music in the bar, weddings and conferences, and no mention whatsoever in the cultural strategy. Hay Hall, £48.7 million worth of funding. No mention of theatre, of course. Cinema was part of the plan, but I don't know whether it's still there or not. Is there going to be a gallery? We don't know. Weddings and conferences. They seem to be doing all right on that front. So I think we should rally around something here. I'm concerned that, if you like, the identity of the town as expressed through its theatre and the well-being of people who live here is not being represented because we're not looking for and having this kind of theatre that we might have. So I think we should rally around a concrete symbol, the Royal Court. It should be this society, I should say, a major concern that a significant building goes unmentioned in current views of the future. And I think it's something that we should all be concerned about. What is happening with this building? As you can see from the history of theatre in Wigan, it's a significant landmark, a significant place. And yet, it's not mentioned in the cultural strategy. The Old Courts, I think, still own it. We don't know what's happening with it. It's very, very unclear indeed. So I said at the outset, it was about looking backwards in order to look forwards. And I feel as though one of the things we can learn from theatre history is the way in which the theatre, the Royal Courts, the Hippodrome are woven into the experiences of people in Wigan. And it's because live theatre does something special for a community and a population. And yet, right now, as we speak in 2025 and looking into the future, there doesn't appear to be a sense of how that kind of culture and that kind of provision is going to happen in people. So I'm being a little bit provocative because I feel quite passionate about what's happening to the Royal Court Theatre building. I think wrong that the council don't seem to want to talk about it, and the Old Courts don't tell us anything about it. And yeah, I think it is something that we should consider. So, the farther you look forward by looking at the past, I think you can learn things. Thank you. The end. Is the truth? I don't know whether I've overrun or not. I forgot to put my timer on. Pardon? Questions and answers. Yes, has anybody got any questions of any sort? Oh. In the present day, you mean? Yeah, he's asking the question of whether cities close by to Wigan would have an impact on what's happening in Wigan right now. Yes, they would, without question. However, so if, for example, if you go into Manchester, you've got things like the Aviva Studios and so on. I mean, Thick Skin Theatre Company, don't forget, are based in Wigan now, and they're a professional company of national significance. But the focus isn't Wigan particularly. So we do have that going on. But yes, access to the theatre elsewhere will have an impact on what's going on here. But I think the history of theatre in Wigan is such that it gives you a sense of, I mean, imagine it really. I mean, King Street is such a depressing place to walk up and down at the moment. I mean, I know things will change and things will get better, but at the moment, it's not a great place to be. But imagine what it was like. You know, people going to see things, interacting with one another, talking to one another, celebrating things together. And I don't think we should lose sight of how valuable theatre can be in that regard. And we do have that asset, and it's something could be done about it. But yeah, I think we live in a different age, so things will be different elsewhere. But at the same time, I think we deserve our own culture as well. I think, yeah, yeah. Been to the cinema. There's only 10 people there. Are people that interested in this kind of thing these days? I think clearly there's a lot of other things that distract people. You know, you've got your phone, you've got YouTube, you've got streaming services, you've got all of those kind of things going on. What that does is atomize people. It separates people generally. And I think what we perhaps losing sight of is what live events can be about. So the riposte, if you like, to that particular point is something like the Oasis reunion. So just think why that has got such dynamic about it is because everyone who experienced it first time around gets in the space together with all the other people. And we have this communal experience. I started the presentation by saying theatre is not just entertainment. It's a lot more than that. It's how people bond. It's how people come together. It's how you form an identity. And live events do that. And you can see that through things like the Oasis reunion thing. So if you're going to have a cultural strategy, I would be suggesting that you make live events a priority. When we did have Richard Ashcroft and Noel Gallagher on at Robin Park very recently, it did serve a purpose of bringing people together. Everybody was talking about it and people went down and got involved. But we need that not less as an occasional thing, but something which is kind of built into what it is that we do. So I think there's a real case for a venue. There's a real case for theatre. In one of the slides earlier on, I mentioned Pit Prop Theatre, and I was talking to my wife Andrew about this, and we were talking because we were involved with that back in the day, and the difference between Pit Prop then, Thick Skin Theatre Company now, it doesn't. Don't get me wrong, I've been to see Thick Skin, fantastic theatre work that they do, but Pit Prop was focused in on the community. And it's affected a lot of people from that point of view. It's not really properly been evaluated, I don't think. And I think a cultural strategy should have in it live theatre and ways in which, as a community, we come together.